September 26, 1983. Just after midnight, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov sat in a reinforced concrete bunker 50 meters underground, south of Moscow. The air was stale and cold. The bunker, codenamed Serpukhov 15, was the nerve center of the Soviet Union's OKO early warning satellite system. OKO meant eye, the eye that would see the American missiles coming. Petrov was 44 years old, a software engineer by training, a systems analyst, not a career military man. His uniform was rumpled. He was filling in for a colleague who had called in sick. He had not expected to be on duty that night. What he did not know, what no one in that bunker could know, was that the next 20 minutes would place the survival of human civilization in his hands. The command post was a warren of consoles and wall-mounted screens showing raw telemetry from satellites 36,000 kilometers above the Earth. Petrov's job was simple in theory, impossible in practice: distinguish real missile launches from system errors. The OKO satellites used infrared sensors to detect the heat signatures of rocket plumes. When they saw one, an alarm triggered. That alarm would travel up the chain of command to General Secretary Yuri Andropov, who had minutes, perhaps only 5, to decide whether to launch a retaliatory nuclear strike. The year 1983 was the most dangerous of the Cold War. In March, President Ronald Reagan had unveiled the Strategic Defense Initiative, derided by the Soviets as Star Wars. In September, just 3 weeks earlier, Soviet interceptors had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into prohibited airspace, killing all 269 aboard. The West was outraged. NATO was conducting Able Archer 83, a command post exercise simulating nuclear war with such unprecedented realism that Soviet intelligence feared it might be cover for an actual first strike. Trust was dead. Both sides had their fingers on the trigger. Just after midnight, the alarm screamed, a siren piercing and relentless. Red lights erupted across the console. On the main wall screen, the word appeared in bold Cyrillic letters: Zapuska. Launch. One of the OKO satellites had detected a single ballistic missile rising from the continental United States. The computer calculated its trajectory, heading for the Soviet Union. Impact in 25 minutes. Petrov's stomach tightened. Protocol was clear. He was to immediately report the detection to the General Staff. They would inform Andropov. Andropov would order retaliation. Soviet doctrine was unambiguous. If the Americans struck first, the motherland would strike back with everything. Thousands of warheads. Mutual assured destruction. But one missile? Petrov stared at the screen. His hand hovered over the phone that connected directly to Soviet high command. The junior officers around him were frozen, waiting for his decision. They had rehearsed this moment hundreds of times. But this was not a drill. The alarm was real. The satellite was functioning. The system said, "Missile launch detected." The system said, "Report immediately." The system said, "Trust the computer." And Petrov did not trust the computer. What they did not know, what even Petrov could not fully articulate in that moment, was that the entire Soviet early warning apparatus, the satellites, the doctrine, the automation, was built on a catastrophic assumption. The assumption was that the system would not lie. The assumption was that technology was infallible. The assumption was that American aggression would be logical, massive, overwhelming. One missile made no sense. But the computer didn't care about sense. The computer only cared about heat signatures and orbital mechanics. Within 3 minutes, the alarm triggered again. 2 more missiles. Then 2 more. 5 American ICBMs, according to the satellite, were now in flight. The Soviet Union had more than 10,000 nuclear warheads aimed at the United States. If Petrov reported this, if he followed orders, the machinery of annihilation would begin. First, the notification to the General Staff, then the alert to the strategic rocket forces, then the briefing of Andropov, then the authorization codes, then the launches. Hundreds of SS-18 Satan ICBMs rising from their silos across the Ural Mountains and Siberia. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles erupting from beneath the Arctic ice. The United States would detect the launches within 90 seconds. They would retaliate. NATO would retaliate. The world would burn. Petrov picked up the phone. His voice was calm. He told the duty officer at headquarters that the system was malfunctioning. He reported it as a false alarm. He had no proof. He had no confirmation from ground-based radar. He had only his gut, his training as an engineer, and one stubborn, impossible fact. The Americans would not start a nuclear war with 5 missiles. If they were going to strike, they would strike with everything. 5 missiles was not a first strike. 5 missiles was absurd. The 20 minutes that followed were the longest of his life. If he was wrong, If the missiles were real, they would hit in minutes. Soviet radar stations on the Kamchatka Peninsula and in Eastern Europe would detect the incoming warheads. They would confirm the attack. And Petrov would be the man who had failed to warn the motherland. The man who had doomed 280 million people. The radar stations saw nothing. The missiles did not exist. The satellite had lied. But why? If you genuinely value these meticulously researched historical stories, if this kind of careful, factual, long-form documentary work speaks to you, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe, but only if this is truly the content you want to see more of. Chapter 1. The Setup. How we built a doomsday machine on a hair trigger. To understand why Stanislav Petrov was placed in that impossible position, alone, underground, with the fate of civilization resting on a single phone call, we must understand how the nuclear standoff of 1983 had become so automated, so paranoid, and so unforgiving that a software glitch could nearly end the world. By September 1983, the United States and Soviet Union together possessed approximately 60,000 nuclear warheads. Federation of American Scientists, Nuclear Notebook, 1983. The vast majority were strategic weapons, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched missiles, and gravity bombs deliverable by long-range bombers. A single Soviet SS-18 Satan ICBM carried 10 independently targetable warheads, each with a yield of 500 to 750 kilotons, 50 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb. The American Minuteman III carried 3 warheads of 170 to 335 kilotons each. These were not weapons designed to destroy military targets. They were designed to annihilate cities. The doctrine governing their use was called Mutual Assured Destruction, or MAD. The logic was coldly elegant. If either side launched a nuclear first strike, the other would retain sufficient forces to launch a devastating counterstrike. Both nations would be destroyed. Therefore, neither would attack. This balance of terror, it was believed, guaranteed peace. But MAD had a fatal vulnerability. It required absolute certainty. If one side believed, correctly or incorrectly, that the other had launched, they had minutes to retaliate before their own missiles were destroyed in their silos. This created an incentive structure that was fundamentally unstable. Launch on warning. Do not wait for the bombs to fall. Do not wait for confirmation. The moment your satellites or radars detect an incoming attack, you launch everything. In the United States, this hair-trigger posture was managed by the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NARAD, buried deep inside Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado. American early warning systems included over-the-horizon radars, the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, BMEWS, in Greenland, Alaska, and the United Kingdom, and the Defense Support Program, DSP satellites, in geosynchronous orbit. These satellites used infrared sensors to detect the heat bloom of rocket launches. They could, in theory, provide 15 to 20 minutes of warning before Soviet ICBMs struck American soil. The Soviets had built a mirror image of this system. Their Oko-I satellite constellation, first deployed in 1972, was designed to detect American missile launches. Unlike the American DSP satellites, which orbited in geosynchronous arcs and provided continuous coverage, the early Oko satellites were in highly elliptical Molniya orbits, optimized for viewing the northern hemisphere. By 1983, the Oko system consisted of 9 satellites: Pavel Podvig, Russian Strategic Nuclear Forces, MIT Press, 2001. They were Soviet engineering at its most pragmatic, simple, rugged, and perpetually on the edge of failure. The ground segment of the Oko system fed data into bunkers like Serpukhov 1-5, where officers like Petrov sat in front of consoles displaying raw telemetry. Their job was to interpret the data, and if the system detected a launch, immediately notify the General Staff. The General Staff would then brief the General Secretary, in 1983, Yuri Andropov, who had sole authority to order a retaliatory strike. In theory, this process would take 5 to 7 minutes. In practice, no one knew. It had never been tested under real conditions. What was certain was that Soviet doctrine left no room for hesitation. The standing orders were clear. If the early warning system detected an American launch, report it immediately. Do not question the machines. This was the world Petrov inhabited on the night of September 26th. A world where 2 superpowers had built vast arsenals of annihilation and then delegated the decision to use them to satellites, computers, and duty officers working overnight shifts in concrete bunkers. It was a system designed for speed, not accuracy, for automation, not judgment. And in 1983, that system was under more stress than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The political climate was toxic. Ronald Reagan had come to office in 1981, promising to confront the Soviet Union with renewed military strength. His administration dramatically increased defense spending, deploying Pershing II intermediate-range ballistic missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles to Western Europe as part of NATO's dual-track decision, a response to Soviet SS-20 deployments. These new American missiles, stationed in West Germany, could reach Moscow in under 10 minutes. The Soviets saw this as an existential threat. The Americans saw it as necessary deterrence. On March 23, 1983, Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a research program to develop space-based missile defenses. The Soviets interpreted SDI as an attempt to achieve first strike capability. If the Americans could shoot down Soviet missiles, MAD would collapse. The nuclear balance would tip. The temptation to strike first, before the American shield was complete, would become overwhelming. Then came Cal 007. On September 1, 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007, a Boeing 747 en route from New York to Seoul, strayed into Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula and Sakhalin Island, areas of extreme strategic sensitivity, home to Soviet ballistic missile submarine bases and air defense installations. Soviet air defense forces, believing the airliner might be an American reconnaissance aircraft, scrambled interceptors. At 3:26 in the morning local time, a Su-15 fighter fired 2 air-to-air missiles, downing the 747. All 269 people aboard were killed, including U.S. FA. Congressman Lawrence MacDonald. The international outcry was immediate and furious. Reagan called it an act of barbarism. The Soviets, initially unaware the aircraft was civilian, later claimed it had been on a spy mission. In reality, it was a navigation error compounded by a catastrophic failure of communication. But in the atmosphere of 1983, explanations didn't matter. What mattered was that both sides now believed the other capable of anything. Into this poisoned environment came Able Archer 83, a NATO command post exercise scheduled for early November. Able Archer was a routine annual exercise, but the 1983 iteration included several changes that alarmed Soviet intelligence. For the first time, it involved the participation of heads of government, Reagan, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, in simulated nuclear decision-making. It used new, encrypted communication formats that Soviet signals intelligence could not break, and it involved the movement of NATO forces in a way that, to Soviet analysts, looked less like an exercise and more like preparation for war. Declassified documents from the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board later revealed that Soviet intelligence agencies, particularly the KGB, had become convinced that the United States was preparing a nuclear first strike disguised as an exercise. National Security Archive, The 1983 War Scare. 2013. The KGB had issued a directive, codenamed R-Yan, an acronym for Nuclear Missile Attack in Russian, ordering recenturas worldwide to watch for signs of American preparations for war. In the fall of 1983, the KGB believed those signs were everywhere. The Soviet leadership was aging and paranoid. Yuri Andropov, who had led the KGB for 15 years before becoming General Secretary in 1982, was gravely ill with kidney disease. He was distrustful of the West and deeply worried about American intentions. Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, 75, and Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, 74, shared his dark worldview. These were men who had lived through the Great Patriotic War, who had seen their country invaded, who had lost tens of millions to fascism. They would not allow it to happen again. If the Americans were preparing to strike, the Soviet Union would strike first. This was the world on September 26, 1983. A world balanced on the edge of the abyss. A world where a single mistake, a satellite malfunction, a misinterpreted radar echo, a computer error, could trigger the end of everything. And that night, the mistake happened. Chapter 2. The Problem. Why we trusted machines with extinction. The fundamental problem that led to the false alarm of September 26 was not technological. It was philosophical. Both superpowers had built early warning systems that were, by design, optimized for one thing: speed. They were not optimized for accuracy. They were not optimized for verification. They were optimized to give leaders enough time to launch a counterstrike before their missiles were destroyed. This created an impossible dilemma. The faster your warning system, the more time you had to decide. But the faster your warning system, the less time you had to verify that the warning was real. In the nuclear calculus of the 1980s, a false positive, detecting a launch that never happened, was considered less dangerous than a false negative, failing to detect a real launch. Better to be safe than sorry. Better to launch on warning than to be caught with your missiles still in their silos. But what happens when safe means starting a nuclear war? The Soviet Oko satellite system was a masterpiece of Cold War engineering, but it had been built under constraints that crippled its reliability. Unlike the American DSP satellites, which were placed in geosynchronous orbit, 24-hour orbits that allowed them to hover over a fixed point on Earth, the Oko satellites used highly elliptical Molniya orbits. These orbits took the satellites on long, looping paths that brought them high above the northern hemisphere for several hours, then swept them low over the southern hemisphere. This design was not a choice. It was a necessity. Soviet rocket technology in the 1970s could not reliably place heavy satellites into geosynchronous orbit at the equator. The Molniya orbit was a workaround, a way to provide coverage of the United States and NATO using the launch capabilities the Soviets actually had. But it came with a cost. The satellites spent only part of their orbit in a position to observe American missile fields. And during the critical apogee, the highest point in their orbit, they were looking down through the atmosphere at oblique angles, watching the curve of the Earth's horizon. This is where the problem began. The satellites used infrared sensors to detect the intense heat of rocket exhaust. A Minuteman III ICBM, lifting off from a silo in Montana or North Dakota, would produce a plume of superheated gas exceeding 3,000 degrees Celsius. This heat signature, blooming against the cold background of space, was unmistakable. Or so the designers believed. What they had not fully accounted for was the problem of the horizon. When an Oko satellite looked down at the Earth's edge, it was looking through layers of atmosphere. And on certain dates, at certain times, when the sun was at a particular angle, sunlight would reflect off high-altitude clouds, thin ice crystal cirrus formations, and produce an infrared signature that looked, to the satellite's sensors, exactly like a missile launch. Soviet engineers knew this was a risk. They had seen false alarms before. On June 3, 1980, a computer at NORAD headquarters displayed a message indicating that 220 Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missiles were in flight toward the United States. Duty officers initiated emergency procedures. Within minutes, bomber crews were running to their aircraft. Then a second check revealed the truth. A faulty computer chip had generated the Phantom missiles. U.S. Prigman, Senate Armed Services Committee, Hearing on False Alerts, 1980. The chip cost 46 cents. 3 days later, on June 6, it happened again. This time, NORAD Systems reported a massive Soviet ICBM launch. Again, bombers were scrambled. Again, it was a false alarm. The cause was the same, a defective integrated circuit in the system's communications processor. These incidents terrified those who understood the stakes. Senator Gary Hart, in testimony before Congress, said the malfunctions revealed how close we may have come to an accidental nuclear war. But the public response was muted. The American system, after all, had multiple layers of verification. NORAD cross-checked satellite data with ground-based radar. Duty officers had standing orders to investigate anomalies before reporting to higher command. The system was designed, at least in theory, to catch its own mistakes. The Soviet system was different. The Oko satellite constellation had no equivalent to American ground-based radar for early verification. Soviet over-the-horizon radars existed, stations at Skrunda in Latvia, Pechora in northern Russia, Mukachevo in Ukraine and elsewhere, but their detection range was limited. They could see incoming warheads, but only after those warheads had traveled most of the way to Soviet territory. By the time the radars confirmed an attack, it would be too late to launch a counterstrike. The missiles would already be destroyed. This meant that the Oko system was in effect the only early warning the Soviet Union had. If the satellite said missiles were launching, the duty officer at Serpukhov 1-5 was supposed to report it. The decision to retaliate would then move up the chain, to the General Staff, to the Defense Council, to the General Secretary. But in a real attack, all of this would happen in under 10 minutes. There was no time for reflection, no time for doubt. The system demanded speed. The system demanded obedience. And so, on the night of September 26th, when Oko satellite Cosmos 1382 reported a missile launch from the central United States, the system did exactly what it was designed to do. It screamed. Stanislav Petrov, sitting at his console, was now the single point of failure. If he followed protocol, he would report the alarm. If he doubted the machine, he would be defying orders, risking his career, and gambling the safety of his country on his own judgment. And if he was wrong, if the missiles were real, he would be remembered as the man who let the motherland die. But Petrov was not a soldier. He was an engineer. And engineers are trained to ask a different question. Not, what does the system say, but why is the system saying this? Chapter 3. The Misread. Why everyone believed the machines couldn't lie. The alarm that sounded in Serpukhov 1-5 was not ambiguous, it was definitive. The console displayed the trajectory, the point of origin, the projected impact zone. The satellite's infrared sensor had detected a heat bloom consistent with a Minuteman III ICBM launch. The computer calculated a probability, 100% launch detected. The junior officers in the bunker looked at Petrov. They had been trained for this moment. The training was repetitive, exhaustive, numbing in its monotony. Detect launch. Report launch. Detect launch. Report launch. There was no step in the protocol that said doubt the computer. There was no step that said wait and see. The standing order was instant notification. And yet Petrov hesitated. Why? Years later, in interviews, Petrov would struggle to articulate his reasoning in that moment. He described it as a funny feeling. David Hoffman, The Dead Hand, Doubleday, 2009. A gut instinct. But beneath that instinct was a question that had been gnawing at him since the alarm first sounded. If the United States was launching a nuclear first strike, why would they launch only one missile? This was the crack in the system's logic. Soviet war planning assumed that an American first strike would be overwhelming. The entire point of a first strike was to destroy the enemy's ability to retaliate. To do that, you would need to hit every ICBM silo, every bomber base, every submarine pen, every command bunker. Simultaneously, you would need hundreds, perhaps thousands of warheads arriving in a coordinated wave. One missile, or even 5, was not a first strike, it was suicide. The American nuclear arsenal in 1983 consisted of approximately 1,000 Minuteman II and Minuteman III ICBMs, 568 submarine-launched ballistic missiles on 36 submarines, and hundreds of gravity bombs deliverable by B-52 and FB-111 bombers. Natural Resources Defense Council, Archive of Nuclear Data, 1983. If the United States intended to launch, they would launch everything. That was the doctrine. That was the plan. 5 missiles made no strategic sense. It was too few to be a first strike, too many to be an accident. It was, in fact, the profile of a malfunction. But Petrov had no way to verify this. He could not call Washington and ask if they were launching missiles. He could not wait for the Soviet radar network to confirm. By the time the radar saw anything, it would be too late. He had only his experience as a systems analyst, his knowledge of American doctrine, and a deep, intuitive distrust of automation. The Soviet military's faith in the OCO system was not irrational. The satellites were reliable by Soviet standards. They had been in operation for over a decade. They had detected dozens of test launches, both Soviet and American, without significant error. The infrared sensors were simple, robust technology. What could go wrong? The answer, as Petrov would later learn, was sunlight. On the night of September 26th, OCO satellite Cosmos 1382 was passing over the United States at the peak of its elliptical orbit. The satellite was positioned such that it was looking down at the Earth's horizon at a shallow angle. The sun, having just set in that part of the world, was shining directly along that horizon, illuminating high-altitude clouds. The clouds, thin cirrus formations made of ice crystals, reflected the sunlight back toward the satellite. The infrared sensor, designed to detect heat, registered the reflected light as a thermal bloom. The computer, programmed to interpret such blooms as missile launches, did exactly what it was told. It declared, "Launch detected." This phenomenon was not unknown to Soviet engineers. It was called a sunlight reflection event. It had been observed before, but it was rare, occurring only under specific geometric conditions. The satellite at the right altitude, the sun at the right angle, clouds at the right height. The designers had assumed these conditions would be so uncommon that false alarms would be negligible. They were wrong. What made the September 26th incident particularly dangerous was that the satellite reported not one false detection, but 5. Each detection corresponded to a different patch of high-altitude cloud catching sunlight at a slightly different moment as the satellite's orbit carried it along the horizon. To the computer, this looked like a ripple launch, a deliberate spacing of missiles to overwhelm defenses. To Petrov, it looked increasingly suspicious. But Petrov did not know about the clouds. He did not know about the sunlight. He knew only that the scenario made no sense. And in that moment, his training as an engineer overrode his training as a soldier. He chose reason over obedience. This was the misread. The Soviet system had been built to trust machines over men. The system assumed that computers were objective, that satellites were infallible, that automation eliminated human error. But automation does not eliminate error. It only changes the nature of error. It moves error from the realm of individual mistakes to the realm of systemic design flaws. And in the nuclear age, a systemic design flaw could kill everyone. The faith in technology was not unique to the Soviet Union. The Americans had the same faith. NORAD's systems were more sophisticated, more redundant, but they too relied on the assumption that sensors did not lie. The false alarms of 1980 had shaken that faith, but only briefly. The system was patched, the faulty chips were replaced, trust was restored. Both superpowers had made the same fundamental error. They had built systems optimized for speed, not for truth. And they had placed those systems in the hands of human beings who were, in the end, expected to behave like machines. Stanislav Petrov, sitting in his bunker, refused to behave like a machine. Chapter 4. The Hidden Strength, the one thing the system didn't account for. The hidden strength that saved the world on September 26, 1983, was not a technology. It was not a redundant system. It was not a fail-safe built into the machinery. It was a middle-aged software engineer who had the courage to say, "I don't believe you." Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov was not supposed to be on duty that night. He was filling in for a colleague. He had been with the Soviet Air Defense Forces for less than 2 years, assigned to the Oko project as a systems analyst. His job was to monitor the satellites, troubleshoot technical problems, and, if necessary, report detections to higher command. He was not a decision-maker. He was a cog in the machine. But Petrov's background gave him something the system had not anticipated: a deeply ingrained skepticism of computers. He had spent years writing software, debugging code, and watching systems fail in strange and unpredictable ways. He knew that computers were not infallible. He knew that automation was only as good as the assumptions programmed into it. And he knew that when a system told you something that contradicted common sense, the system was probably wrong. This knowledge, this lived experience of how machines fail, was the hidden strength. It was not part of the protocol. It was not in the manual. It was not something that could be automated. It was human judgment. Messy, subjective, fallible human judgment. And on this particular night, it was enough. When the first alarm sounded, Petrov's immediate reaction was not panic, but confusion. The detection made no sense. One missile, he later recalled thinking, when people start a war, they don't start it with only 5 missiles. Hoffman, the dead hand. This was not technical analysis. It was common sense. But it was common sense grounded in knowledge of American military doctrine, which Petrov had studied as part of his training. The United States' Single Integrated Operational Plan, SIOP, the blueprint for nuclear war, called for massive, coordinated strikes. A first strike scenario would involve hundreds of Minuteman missiles launching in salvos, waves of submarine-launched missiles, bomber wings taking off from bases across the continental United States. The goal would be to destroy Soviet command and control before the Soviets could react. 5 missiles could not accomplish this. 5 missiles would only provoke retaliation. 5 missiles would guarantee mutual annihilation without achieving any strategic objective. Petrov did not articulate all of this in the moment. He did not have time. The alarms were screaming. The junior officers were staring at him. The protocol was clear. Report immediately. But instead of picking up the phone to the general staff, he hesitated. He demanded more information. He asked the operators to check the satellite's status. He looked for ground-based radar confirmation. There was none. The radar saw nothing. And then the system reported more missiles. 2, then 2 more. 5 in total. The computer's confidence level remained at 100%, but Petrov's suspicion only deepened. If this was a real attack, why were the missiles launching one at a time, spaced seconds apart? Why not a simultaneous mass launch? The staggered timing made the detection look even more like a glitch, a cascade failure where one false positive triggered another. Petrov made his decision. He picked up the phone to headquarters and reported the alarm as a system malfunction. He told them the satellite was experiencing a false alert. He did not say probable malfunction or possible malfunction, he stated it as fact. This was a critical detail. By presenting it as a technical failure rather than a judgment call, he gave his superiors a reason not to escalate. He gave them an out. And then he waited. The next 20 minutes were by all accounts agonizing. Petrov chain-smoked. He watched the clock. If the missiles were real, they would arrive soon. The Soviet radar network would detect them. The general staff would call back, demanding to know why he had not reported the attack. And Petrov would have no answer. He had bet everything on his gut. The radars detected nothing. The missiles did not exist. The alarm was false. Petrov had been right. But his vindication was not immediate. In fact, it was incomplete. The Soviet military did not celebrate his judgment. They did not praise his restraint. Instead, they quietly investigated the incident. An internal review confirmed that the satellite had malfunctioned due to a rare alignment of the sun, the satellite's orbit, and high-altitude clouds. The system was patched. Procedures were revised. And Petrov was told, informally, that he had made the correct decision. But he received no commendation. no medal, no public recognition. Why? Because acknowledging Petrov's heroism would mean acknowledging the system's fragility. It would mean admitting that the Soviet Union's early warning apparatus, one of the pillars of its strategic defense, had nearly triggered a nuclear war over a reflection of sunlight. It would mean admitting that the machinery of deterrence was built on sand. And so the incident was classified. Petrov was quietly reassigned. The Soviet public never learned how close they had come to annihilation. The American public never learned that their existence had been preserved by the judgment of a single Soviet officer they would never meet. The hidden strength was this: the system had been designed to eliminate human error, but it was a human being, flawed, subjective, disobedient, who saved it from destroying itself. Chapter 5. The Proof. What the investigation revealed. The proof of what happened on September 26, 1983, did not come quickly. The Soviet military, embarrassed by the malfunction and disturbed by how close the system had come to failure, conducted an internal investigation that remained classified for over a decade. It was not until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that details began to emerge, and even then, the full story remained fragmentary. The technical cause of the false alarm was eventually determined. Sunlight reflecting off high-altitude cirrus clouds had created infrared signatures that the OCO satellite sensors interpreted as rocket plumes. This was a known risk, but the combination of orbital geometry and atmospheric conditions on September 26 created a perfect storm. The satellite was at the right altitude, the sun was at the right angle, and the clouds were positioned precisely where they could reflect light directly into the satellite's field of view. The investigation revealed several contributing factors. First, the OCO system lacked the sophisticated filtering algorithms that later satellites would employ to distinguish between missile launches and natural phenomena. The sensors simply reported what they saw, a heat signature above a certain threshold. The computer did the rest, applying pre-programmed logic that said heat signature equals missile. Second, the satellite's position in its Molniya orbit meant it was looking down at the Earth's limb, the curved edge of the planet as seen from space, where atmospheric effects were most pronounced. American DSP satellites, by contrast, looked straight down from geosynchronous orbit, reducing the likelihood of such reflections. Third, the system had no automated cross-check with ground-based radar. In the American system, NORAD protocol required satellite detections to be confirmed by BMEWS radar before escalating to higher command. The Soviet system had no such requirement. The satellite data was treated as authoritative. This was a catastrophic design flaw, but it was also an unavoidable one. Soviet radar could not detect missiles at launch. It could only see them as they approached Soviet territory, by which time it would be too late. The proof of the system's unreliability came in the form of subsequent false alarms. On January 25, 1995, over a decade after Petrov's incident, Russian early warning radars detected what appeared to be a submarine-launched ballistic missile rising from the Norwegian Sea. The missile was on a trajectory that could reach Moscow in minutes. The Russian military went to high alert. President Boris Yeltsin was awakened and presented with the nuclear briefcase. He had approximately 5 minutes to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike. The missile was a Norwegian scientific research rocket launched to study the aurora borealis. The Norwegians had notified the Russian government of the launch in advance, but the notification had not reached the military's radar operators. Only Yeltsin's decision to wait for confirmation prevented a catastrophe. Stephen Aftergood, the 1995 Norwegian rocket incident. Federation of American Scientists, 1995. This incident demonstrated that the vulnerability Petrov had exposed in 1983, the reliance on automated systems with inadequate verification, had not been fully addressed even after the Soviet Union's collapse. The Russian Federation inherited the same early warning architecture, the same protocols, the same risks. The proof also came in the form of American incidents. On November 9, 1970, NORAD computers displayed indications of a massive Soviet ICBM and submarine-launched missile attack. The duty officer initiated a threat assessment conference. 10 intercontinental ballistic missile bases were put on alert. The National Emergency Airborne Command Post, a specially configured Boeing 747, designed to serve as a flying command center in the event of nuclear war, was readied for takeoff. Then, within 6 minutes, the alert was canceled. The cause was a training tape that had been mistakenly inserted into the operational system, feeding simulated attack data into live consoles. Scott Sagan, The Limits of Safety, Princeton University Press, 1993. These incidents, Soviet, Russian, and American, painted a disturbing picture. The early warning systems that both superpowers relied on were fundamentally fragile. They were vulnerable to technical malfunctions, human error, atmospheric anomalies, and simple bad luck. And in every case, the safeguard was not a technological fix but a human decision, an officer who chose to wait, to verify, to doubt. The scoreboard, if one could even compile such a thing, was terrifying. Between 1977 and 1984, NORAD logged 1,152 moderately serious false alarms. Incidents serious enough to trigger initial alerts, but resolved before bombers launched or missiles were readied. USW. Government Accountability Office Report NORAD's Missile Warning System, 1981. The Soviet Union's record was never declassified, but there is no reason to believe it was better. If anything, the OCO system's technical limitations suggest it was worse. What the investigation into the September 1983 incident ultimately proved was not just that the system had failed, it proved that the system was designed to fail. The logic of mutual assured destruction demanded hair-trigger alert. The technology of the 1980s could not provide certainty. The combination was lethal. And the only thing preventing annihilation was the willingness of individuals, people like Stanislav Petrov, people whose names we will never know, to refuse the logic of the machine. Chapter 6. The Response That Never Came. What didn't happen next? The most remarkable thing about the September 26th incident is what did not happen. There was no public outcry, no congressional hearing, no international summit to address the dangers of automated nuclear command systems. The Soviet Union buried the incident. The United States never learned of it. And the world continued, utterly unaware that it had come within minutes of extinction. Stanislav Petrov received no medal, no promotion, no commendation. In fact, his superiors reprimanded him. Not for his decision to report the alarm as a false alert. That decision, they quietly acknowledged, had been correct. They reprimanded him for failing to properly document the incident in his logbook. The military bureaucracy, faced with a near catastrophe, chose to focus on paperwork. Petrov was reassigned to a less sensitive post. He was encouraged, informally, not to discuss the incident. He served out the remainder of his career in obscurity and retired in 1984. For over a decade, he lived in a small apartment outside Moscow. Unknown, unremarked, a footnote to a history that had not yet been written. It was not until 1998 that Petrov's story became public, when a Russian journalist, researching the history of the OCO system, uncovered references to the September 1983 incident. Petrov, by then retired and living on a modest pension, was tracked down and interviewed. His account was astonishing, but it was also incomplete. Much of what happened that night remained classified. Details were fragmentary. Dates were uncertain. Petrov himself, in his recollections, mixed up some of the specifics. Historians later had to cross-reference Soviet military records to confirm the timeline. The story reached the West in the early 2000s. Petrov was invited to the United Nations in 2006, where he was honored by the Association of World Citizens with the World Citizen Award. In 2012, he was featured in a documentary film, The Man Who Saved the World. He gave interviews. He spoke at conferences. He became, belatedly, a symbol of the fragility of nuclear deterrence. But the systemic response, the changes to doctrine, to technology, to the architecture of nuclear command and control, was minimal. The Soviet Union, and later Russia, continued to operate early warning systems with the same fundamental vulnerabilities. The United States continued to maintain its forces on high alert, ready to launch within minutes. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction remained in place. Why? Because the logic of deterrence is unforgiving. Both sides are trapped in a game where the worst-case scenario dictates behavior. If you slow down your response time to allow for verification, you risk being caught with your missiles in their silos. If you remove automation and require human judgment, you risk hesitation and a real attack. The paradox is inescapable. The safer you make the system, the less credible your deterrent. The more credible your deterrent, the more dangerous the system. The end of the Cold War did not resolve this paradox. It merely reduced the stakes. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The ideological conflict that had driven the arms race evaporated. Strategic arms reduction treaties, START I, START II, New START, reduced deployed warhead counts from their Cold War peaks, but thousands of weapons remained, on both sides, ready to launch. As of 2025, the United States and Russia together possess approximately 11,000 nuclear warheads, with roughly 3,700 actively deployed. Federation of American Scientists, Nuclear Notebook 2024. Many of these weapons remain on hair-trigger alert. The early warning systems are more sophisticated than they were in 1983, but they are not infallible. Satellites still malfunction. Radars still generate false echoes, computers still make mistakes, and human beings still sit in bunkers, watching screens, waiting for alarms. The response that never came, the global reckoning, the systemic reform, the acknowledgement of just how close we came, is perhaps the most damning proof of all. It is proof that we learned nothing, or rather, we learned something and chose to ignore it. We learned that the system is fallible, that automation is not safety, that speed is not security, and we decided that the risks were acceptable. Petrov died in 2017, at the age of 77, in the same small apartment where he had lived in obscurity for decades. His death went unnoticed for months. It was only when a German filmmaker tried to contact him for a follow-up interview that the world learned he was gone. Chapter 7, Conclusion. The Scoreboard and the Permanent Change. The scoreboard is simple and stark. On September 26, 1983, the Soviet Union's Oko early warning system falsely detected a United States missile launch. Protocol demanded an immediate report to Soviet High Command. If that report had been made, the General Staff would have alerted General Secretary Yuri Andropov. Andropov, gravely ill and deeply paranoid about American intentions, would have had minutes to decide whether to order a retaliatory nuclear strike. We cannot know what Andropov would have decided. We cannot know if the Soviet system would have launched. What we know is this: one man, sitting alone in a bunker, made a decision that prevented the question from ever being asked. Stanislav Petrov chose doubt over obedience. He chose reason over protocol, and the world survived. The permanent change was not a change in technology or doctrine. The permanent change was a story. A story that reveals the profound fragility of the systems we built to protect us. A story that forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. During the Cold War, the survival of human civilization depended not on deterrence, not on missile silos or submarine patrols, but on individuals. Fallible, mortal, frightened individuals who had the courage to refuse the logic of the machine. This is not a comforting truth. It is not the story we tell ourselves about the Cold War. We prefer to believe that mutual assured destruction worked, that deterrence held, that the system was stable. But the system was never stable. It was balanced on a knife's edge, and on multiple occasions, 1962, 1979, 1980, 1983, 1995, it nearly fell. The lessons of September 26 are as relevant today as they were 4 decades ago. The technologies have improved. Satellites have better sensors. Computers have faster processors. Communication systems are more secure. But the fundamental problem remains. Nuclear weapons demand instant decisions, and instant decisions are incompatible with certainty. The automation we rely on, the early warning satellites, the command and control networks, the digital systems that link sensors to silos, creates an illusion of control. But automation does not eliminate risk. It changes the nature of risk. It moves decisions from human operators to algorithms, from judgment calls to pre-programmed responses. And when those algorithms encounter scenarios their designers did not anticipate, they fail, sometimes catastrophically. Petrov's decision was not heroic because he defied orders. It was heroic because he trusted his own mind over a machine that everyone else trusted implicitly. In a system designed to eliminate human error, he reintroduced human judgment, and in doing so, he saved the world. The tragedy is that his example was not heeded. The Soviet Union did not dismantle its hair trigger alert. The United States did not either. Both nations and their successors continue to maintain nuclear forces capable of launching within minutes. The assumption remains that speed is safety, that automation is reliability, that deterrence requires the threat of instant retaliation. But September 26, 1983 proved otherwise. It proved that speed is danger. It proved that automation is fallibility. It proved that the real deterrent is not the missile, but the human being who chooses not to launch. There is a final, unsettling detail to Petrov's story. In later interviews, he was asked how he felt about being called the man who saved the world. His response was characteristically understated. He said he was just doing his job. He said he was lucky to be there, lucky to have the background that let him see through the alarm. He said that if someone else had been on duty, someone who trusted the system more, someone who followed protocol, the outcome might have been different. Think about that. The survival of civilization came down to luck, to the fact that one particular engineer was filling in for a colleague who called in sick, to the fact that this engineer had spent years debugging software and knew how computers could lie, to the fact that he was willing to risk his career, his freedom, perhaps his life, on a hunch. Cook, this is the permanent lesson of September 26th. We are not as safe as we think we are. The systems we have built to protect us are not as reliable as we believe. And the margin between survival and annihilation is thinner than we dare imagine. Stanislav Petrov died in obscurity. The bunker where he made his decision has been decommissioned. The Oko satellite system has been replaced by newer technology. But the danger remains. Thousands of nuclear weapons, on hair-trigger alert, waiting for the next alarm. And the question we must ask ourselves is this: when the next alarm sounds, and it will sound, because systems fail, will there be another Stanislav Petrov? Someone with the knowledge, the courage, the sheer stubborn refusal to trust the machine, or will the next duty officer follow protocol?